That's why freedom doesn't have to mean that we have no emotions. I mean, that's a very advanced state of consciousness where there are no emotions consistently. What's more important is that we can let our experience be as it is and relativize and continue to have access to a bigger perspective. That's a more relevant step for where we're at as human species right now. To realize that freedom doesn't mean you don't experience a certain emotion or you don't experience a certain perspective. It means that you're not constricted by it. You can see beyond it while it's happening. So then you can experience more and more simultaneously peace and freedom and bliss and pain and suffering and confusion, which sounds very weird, but you can have a simultaneous experience where they both coexist within the same state of consciousness or space of consciousness.
What about disconnect? Can you like experience disconnect while not having disconnect apply to you?
That's a good way actually of making the distinction. The experience of disconnect hasn't happened for me for a long time, except maybe there were a few very short moments which served a particular purpose, mainly to, for a moment, give me a taste of what it's like again, to be in the shoes of some of the people that I'm sharing my message with. So it generates, because if you don't have that experience of disconnect for, let's say, 2 years in a row, your perspective changes so much. And your perspective of stuckness and victimization changes so much that it becomes kind of difficult to relate to someone who believes they're disconnected, stuck, or victimized. You can understand it, but sometimes, I guess, I've wanted for myself or needed sort of a reminder of, oh, this is what it feels like when you have no access. So my experience of that is that even that wasn't personal still. That was me from a higher level of my consciousness than my ordinary physical consciousness, giving me a taste, an experience of disconnect that is very much out of my own free will. That's how that was experienced.
Like within your own free will?
Within my own free will, I was fully aware that I experienced the disconnect, but at the same time, I was fully aware. So I experienced the disconnect as real in that moment, but still, I was fully aware of the fact that I was choosing it for a purpose. Because at some point, you just can't disconnect entirely anymore, right? And that's what I hope to give people access to through this kind of work, because it's worth it. It's worth the practice. It's worth the understanding. And it's people's birthright to understand this and to be free and to ever know their connection to Source. And it will heal everything. It will heal everything in our thinking.
I think what you said earlier was important to remember, that we can never truly be disconnected, but only feel that we are disconnected.
Yep. And this might be too intellectual to really hit home if you're in an emotional state, but it can still be somewhat helpful if you realize in a moment where you feel so disconnected, if you remember that, first of all, you cannot ever be disconnected from consciousness, from God, from existing, from this infinite creation. And the proof for that in that moment is the fact that you're feeling disconnected. If you know the emotional guidance system and how it operates, because of your connection to the true reality of God, you can feel the emotional guidance system kicking in as the feeling of disconnect when you're believing that you're disconnected. The feeling of disconnect is just an emotion. It's just showing you the contrast of your belief in disconnect with the truth of connection. So the feeling of disconnect is evidence that you're still connected. Because again, what is understanding? It is having more than one access point or perspective. You can't understand object A if you're not also having object or space B to compare it with. Understanding is a process of comparison. It's a process of contrast. It's a process of context. It's a process of having multiple views. A thing can never understand itself. It needs an observer. Similarly, your thought process cannot understand itself. It needs a different perspective to view that object or that thought. But if you have become so identified, unified with that perspective that's causing the afflictive state, then you can't understand it. So don't even try. Let it be. Focus on your access point to a new perspective, which again can just be meaningless object that you're concentrating on. And then the acceptance of self will follow. The understanding of that will naturally follow over time as you gain access again to greater freedom. If you really gain access to freedom, then it's instantly understood, typically. It's very like, of course, because you just see from such a clear point of view. There's no substance, there's no matter, there's no gravity anymore to the perspective that was impossible to understand when you were in its gravitational field. And you had not a bigger gravitational field of your own to contrast it by, to understand it with. So know yourself, accept yourself, and become the creator. These are very much linked. The more you become the creator, the easier it is to know and understand and accept yourself on a relative level as well. And sometimes not having access to it, to understanding yourself, leads instantly into accepting yourself. And then that opens the door again to knowing the creator. And then when that afflictive emotion again arises, you'll understand it and you'll be able to accept it because you have a new space of consciousness to compare it to understand it by.